So, I finally got to sit down and watch the most anticipated horror movie of the year, 2013. To say that Slender Man is a movie out a little too late would be an understatement. The creepypasta legend on which the film is based is practically a fossil now in internet years. Once upon a time, this would have been a goddamn cinematic event, the likes of which budding internet horror writers, DeviantArt artists, and I guess My Little Pony fans would have lost their collective shit for. This film should have been a big deal, a huge deal, but apparently Sony felt the opportune time for the development of a major blockbuster surrounding one of the most significant horror figures in pop culture for the last decade was not to strike while the iron was hot, but rather wait until the iron is also very, very icy cold that you could see the iron's nipples through the Slender Man morph suit it was wearing. Slender Man as a concept has drifted so far out of public consciousness now that he's lost any and all mystique. There was a period where he was something close to a figurehead of a new wave of internet-led immersive fiction, where multiple people would all contribute as a community to this collective creepy idea, and presented their stories with just enough of a basis in reality that you could still convince newcomers to him there was some spooky truth to it all, but that period is long gone. Now before I go on, I know it's not cool to say anymore, but I'll put my hand up and say, I think this guy is awesome. I don't necessarily enjoy the stories that made him famous so much as what they represent. I love the idea of the communal myth, something that imaginative individuals take a hold of and spiral into something much bigger than its origins to create a modern urban legend. I mean, think about this for a second. Slender Man and other characters and stories like him had hundreds of thousands of kids actively logging on to a literature site. Besides maybe Harry Potter, what could you ever say encourage kids to read as much as creepypasta did? I mean, granted, not all of the reading material was of good quality or age appropriate, and some would argue presented a bad influence that led to the tragic events surrounding an attack on a young girl, which was admittedly awful, but I question the actual impact a creepypasta scapegoat truly had on those events. The thing is though, as a result of all these kids and so many other people contributing to the Slender Man mythos over so many years, the character himself has become massively oversaturated to the point where he has no punch anymore and all but a very niche audience have long since moved on. When there's a few creepy photos on the internet and a couple of forum posts, the legend remains enigmatic. As a concept, he captures the anxieties of a generation that grew up with the internet, and that feeling of stumbling down this rabbit hole of information that wasn't available before it, only to find yourself in one of its dark corners learning a little more than you ever wanted to know. However, when you've got Slenderman bobbleheads, Slenderman coffee mugs, Slenderman parodies, Slenderman stickers, Slenderman plushies, Slenderman games, Slenderman webcomics on top of hundreds of thousands of different mentions of Slenderman in all different corners of the web to significantly varied degrees of quality, well then you start to lose any and all meaning you ever had. To stumble across the Slenderman mythos now, as opposed to in its heyday when it was beginning to pick up steam, is similar to the difference between seeing an iconic horror villain in the movie that made him famous versus seeing him as a costume attraction at a theme park. I know I'm going on about this a lot, but I can't stress enough how utterly out of touch the decision to make a Slenderman film is now. I mean, even when Sony started development back in 2016, it was already kinda too late, as at that point we were already saturated not just with Slenderman content, but specifically visual media on the character. We were already about to get a documentary on the infamous Slenderman-inspired stabbing, and we'd already had a wildly popular 92-episode web series, and that series was going to get a follow-up, and that already had a spin-off side series, and it already had a spin-off Slenderman feature film. I mean, Sony are making this so long past the fad that I'm expecting them to announce a movie on fidget spinners in 2030. You know, right after we get the Beyblade film about 2025. Side note, by the way, in Beyblade canon, the Bible states that the crossing of the Red Sea happened when Moses, a Beyblade master, once ripped a Beyblade so fucking gnarly that it split the ocean so his people could cross. This, of course, also implies that there is a Beyblade Jesus. None of that is relevant to any point I want to make. I just thought everybody should know. Anyway, obviously as a result of this misguided decision, the film had the odds stacked against it from the get-go. Horror films work best when they don't show too much of the monster, but the creators here didn't have that option and had to start from an already disadvantageous position. Then again though, a good movie is a good movie, regardless of when it's made. Even with this initial handicap, the character has way more than enough conceptual substance that you could definitely make a good film out of him, even now. And with the right backing and capable hands, maybe this could have been the film that injected the fear and anxiety back into an internet powerhouse that had long since lost it. Spoilers, it didn't do that. Slender Man the movie is awful. Like, truly terrible. One of the worst films I have seen in a long ass time. I mean, look, right, he has the gist of the whole film, okay? And obviously spoilers, by the way, for the review from here on out, but I seriously wouldn't worry about ruining the experience for yourself if you haven't seen it, because that implies there's something to ruin. So he has the gist. He has the gist, alright? Just hear us out. These 4 girls, right, decide to watch a spooky video on the internet, which results in the Slender Man deciding to haunt them. Then we get an hour of inconsequential, creepy shit with no rhyme, reason, nor direction, like we're on a shitty ghost train ride, just being dragged along from one jump scare to the next. Then the film suddenly and abruptly ends when Slender Man catches one of the girls and turns them into a tree. Then the credits roll. I'm not fucking kidding, that's the whole thing, and I am not exaggerating when I say there is no more substance to it than that abridged summary. I can't remember the last time I've seen a horror film so agonizingly dull. There is nothing, and I mean nothing, to grab onto here. Every little bit of this film feels like a half-baked first draft. Just look at the characters, for example. You've got these 4 girls, and you know they're the old traditional archetypes. Like you got your edgy one, and then you got your the other 3. Jesus, they didn't even bother to give these characters archetypes. They're not people, they're just 4 interchangeable scream emitters the filmmakers can torment. The only one who has anything remotely resembling a personality is Ren, the edgy girl, but the second the haunting stuff starts, she just turns into the same screaming avatar as all the others. Hell, the film can't even decide who the main character is. At first I thought it was Ren, as she seemed to be the only one doing anything remotely resembling being proactive by trying to stop the hauntings or save her friends. I mean, her attempts were a little aimless as well as few and far between, but she was at least giving us something to drive forward the plot amongst all the mindlessness of it all. But no, apparently she wasn't. At about the 3/4 mark, she just kind of disappears for a bit, and then we suddenly start following one of the other girls who, out of nowhere, dominates the 3rd act of the plot for a quick narrative about her relationship with her sister, when Ren got the bulk of star time for the first 2 acts. The 3rd and 4th characters only exist to firstly disappear, with the plot to find her never really resolved in any meaningful way, and secondly go crazy, which everyone just kind of accepts and moves on from, as if their friend literally losing her mind is just some totally bland occurrence and not some life-changing awfulness. While I was watching it, I couldn't scratch the feeling that this film was unfinished. Like, let's go back to the girl that loses her mind, okay? This occurs because she sees Slender Man during a sequence where the girls go into the woods, and that apparently makes her insane. So the next day at school, one of the characters just kind of goes, "Oh, her mom says she's sick and that's why she's not here anymore." And that's about as big a deal as made of it, until eventually they remember she exists and go to check up on her, only to find that she's spookily staring out of her window and being completely unresponsive, at which point their only reaction is to go, "Yikes, that's creepy, let's move on and never see or mention her again." Okay? The whole film feels pointless. And I don't just mean that from the angle of why make it this late, but rather why make this film at all? And I mean, I know the answer's money, and I guess there is a level of cynical existentialism from which you could make the claim, well, all films are pointless, Daniel. But if you're going to do that, I would firstly say, stop reading the works of Nietzsche, you're clearly misinterpreting him, you miserable prick. And secondly, you must admit, even if you think all movies are pointless, which is not true, that this one at least feels significantly more pointless than others. For the first 90% of its runtime, it doesn't want to say or do anything. Like, I don't get it. Almost all movies have something to say, even if it's as baseline as Fast and the Furious going, cars are proper cool and family is important. It at least gives you fucking something to work with. But apparently Slender Man isn't concerned with anything so menial as story. Well, at least not until the last 10 minutes, when suddenly out of nowhere the film wants to be about sisterhood very briefly, and then turn into a PSA about the dangers of creepypasta. Yeah, I'm not kidding about that. After Slender Man makes each of the 4 main girls meet unfortunate fates, including turning our sudden 3rd act protagonist into a fucking tree, Real terrifying stuff there, guys. The only thing we're left with is a quick epilogue narration from the surviving younger sister who's all like, well, that's what you get when you engage with creepypasta online, you know, they took it too far, and now she's a tree. Get the fuck off your moral high horse, Sony. You couldn't even make this film and reap the benefits of the millions you hope it produces without the exact literature you're now condemning. What are you, fucking Sunday school? Calm your shit, lads. It would be almost salvageable if it at least packed a good scare. At least then, a casual teen audience might maybe get a fun but forgettable evening's kick out of it all on a night out with their mates. But the scariest moment for me the whole film was when the fella next to us farted. I guess it's terrifying if you have a very specific phobia of shots of dimly lit twigs, which makes up about 70% of the film. But other than that, nah. I mean, I suppose you could argue the jump scares are effective, but only in the way that blasting an air horn in the ear of someone sleeping is an effective alarm clock. Sure, the big noises might make you jolt, but there's no surrounding tension or malice to the events to make you feel dread when they're coming. I mean, a perfect example of a missed mark is in the inciting incident. The whole film's events come about because the main female cast are hanging out and decide to go online and summon Slender Man because the boys at the other party are doing it, since apparently that's what teenagers do in this world instead of getting drunk. And so they watch this creepy video that allegedly summons this monster, and in a completely misguided move, this is probably the best produced sequence in the whole thing. You remember how in the film The Ring, which this film is clearly ripping off at this point, the inciting incident for the victims was that creepy videotape, and when the characters would watch it, it was all like grainy, and some bits you kind of couldn't really make out what was going on, and it had all these jarring cuts and weird, confusing imagery that really sold the idea that there was something uncomfortable and unnatural about the contents of this tape. Yeah, that doesn't happen here. In Slender Man on the creepy video, shit's all fucking nicely framed and has drone shots and lovely atmospheric tracking bits. Got a little bit of a nice colour filter going on, you know? Like a gothic fashion photo shoot. Get fucked! Why Slender Man got such a keen eye for cinematography? You're telling me this supernatural, mysterious, demon-summoning, black magic motherfucker just happens to have the production values of a Hollywood picture? Is our long-armed killer also a fucking Instagram model enthusiast? What the hell is this? I'm not remotely buying that our protagonists have stumbled onto some dark corner of the internet when that corner appears to have had camera crew, huge budgets, and apparently a fucking red epic cinema camera. Outside of that sequence, the other scares suffer problems too, by happening to characters we have no reason to care for, not building intention in any way prior to the fright, and going on for too long to have any impact. A particularly embarrassing moment sees one of the teenagers hallucinate that a guy she's making out with smile contorts into an evil demonic face. Fine in theory, except we keep cutting back and forth to his face and her screaming, with the demon face getting more and more ridiculous each time, to the point of it honestly feeling like a comedy sketch parody of itself. This isn't the only moment that suffers in this way, of course. A lot of the supposed big frights have a great deal of unintentional comedy. One of my personal favourite scary bits is when Slender Man taunts two of the girls by FaceTiming them. Holy fuck, that's hilarious. Can't wait for the sequel where Jeff the Killer slides into them DMs, or the third entry where Smile Dog adds his victims on Snapchat. What's even funnier is the film does this not once, but twice! They thought the idea of having Slender Man video call his victims from outside their houses was so good, it had to happen on multiple occasions. It's supposed to be an occurrence of some creepy black magic shit, but it definitely conjures up images of Slender Man stood in the dark trying to get bars of signal on his iPhone so he can pull off this whole shtick. Other scares are impeded by the film simply being too dark. And I don't mean dark thematically, I mean, wow, I'm really enjoying this shot of the characters dressed as ninjas looking for a black cat under a solar eclipse, as told through the perspective of Stevie Wonder. At least that might as well be what I'm saying, because fuck knows what I'm looking at. They even managed to make it dark as shit during the day scenes, which is almost impressive, really. I recall one moment where there was a side shot of two characters talking at school, and while I could easily see the school in the background, the characters were total silhouettes in what appeared to be a shade of pitch blackness. Like, how do you even do that? I mean, maybe they were putting it in there thematically to say these characters were in the darkness now, but like, wow, did it not work? I mean, honestly, I could go on and on forever about how much this movie misses the mark. I haven't even mentioned the over-reliance of CG that gives us a corny-ass scene where a giant spider Slender Man chases a girl in a moment that looks less horror and more Harry Potter, or the awkward, stilted dialogue that makes me think no one at Sony has ever even seen a teenager. I suppose that would explain why they chose to make a Slender Man film in 2018. Or the off-putting use of constant montages, surreal imagery, and sequences that I guess are supposed to come off as artsy but really just make no sense in the context of the narrative, including a scene where we have to watch one of the girls aimlessly meander through the hallways of a hospital in agonizing slow motion until a jump scare wakes her up from her dream, but guess what? She's not actually woken up yet because she's still in a dream, and another jump scare wakes her up, and god damn, this was bad. Mind-numbingly boring, painfully inconsequential, and cripplingly neutered of any punch. This is absolutely one to avoid at all costs. It's not even so bad it's good, it's so bad it's horrible. Whether that's down to being scared by real-world occurrences causing re-edits, misguided filmmaking in general, or a problematic production process, I do not know. But what I do know is that if I had the choice to choose between watching this again or taking on the fate of its victims and being turned into a tree, then plant my arse in the ground and let dogs piss on us, because I will be taking the fucking tree.